part of this meeting, then they'd be able to go there to check it out. So welcome. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. I'm going to share my screen. Oops, one moment. Gotta bring you all back with me here. Figuring out this hybrid meeting approach. I might actually put the slides over here so that Glenn can see them too. Okay. All right, so we're going to jump right in. We're going to kick off the public meeting with a presentation of the methods that are posted for public comment, and then we're going to leave plenty of time for public comment at the end for about the second half of the meeting. And we're planning to be here until we're done with public comment or around 1:30. So thanks everyone for joining us. Today's public meeting is on water quality restoration formula grant targets and fund allocation methodology. And my name's Emily Bird. I'm the Clean Water Initiative Program Manager here at the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. And I'm joined today by Ben Copans, who's with the Watershed Planning Program, and he's the planning supervisor. So, all right, for today's agenda, I'm going to start out with an overview of the agenda. We're going to give an overview of some background of the Clean Water Service Delivery Act, which we nickname or refer to as Act 76 of 2019. Then Ben and I will provide an overview of the draft methodology of our formula grant targets and fund allocation approach. And then we're going to give an overview of the public notice and comment period, the timeline and how to comment to wrap us up with our presentation. And then we will open it up for public comment. And I think we only had one person who had signed up ahead of time to comment, but if anyone has any questions or would like to comment at the end, you're welcome to jump in and do so. There are a few breaks in the slides where I'll pause to see if there's any clarifying questions on the content that we're presenting. So feel free to hold your questions until we get to that point. Otherwise, we'll have time at the end. And these presentation slides are posted on the website that's linked here, as well as on the Clean Water Service Delivery Act website. Taking me the wrong direction here. Okay, so for an overview of the Clean Water Service Delivery Act, just before we dive into the restoration needs we have here, I wanted to highlight that Vermonters care a lot about clean water overall. We have high water quality. We have a lot of exceptional water resources that Vermonters and visitors alike enjoy and recreate on, and it boosts our economy and brings about habitat and a number of co-benefits. But at the same time, we do have some water quality restoration challenges here in the state, and the priority water quality issues that we are working to resolve with our clean water funding and our planning efforts have to do with excess nutrients that are in the system, causing an imbalance that can lead to, in the case of fresh water, where there's excess phosphorus leads to these cyanobacteria blooms, which can be harmful and sometimes toxic. So in Lake Memphremagog Basin, in the northeast of the state, as well as the Lake Champlain Basin, which is the western half of the state approximately, we are working to target phosphorus pollution reductions as part of a phosphorus restoration plan that we refer to as a total maximum daily load, or TMDL. And then the eastern half of the state, the Connecticut River Basin, drains to the Long Island Sound, and Long Island Sound is impaired for low dissolved oxygen that's caused by a nitrogen imbalance in the saltwater system. So most of our state is covered by these large scale, what we call total maximum daily loads, or TMDLs, where we are working to reduce the nutrient pollution to improve water quality. And oh, it keeps doing that. My apologies. I need to fix this. There we go. So back in 2015, and even a couple years or a few years before that, the Lake Champlain restoration plan, the Lake Champlain phosphorus TMDL, was reopened for revision. And a big piece of that update to the Lake Champlain TMDL was to provide better reasonable assurance that we'd be able to reduce phosphorus by targeting what we refer to as non-point sources of pollution, really the rain runoff and snow melt driven transported sources of nutrient pollution, in particular phosphorus for Lake Champlain. And so in order to demonstrate that we could make progress addressing these landscape sources of phosphorus, the state of Vermont passed what we refer to as the Vermont Clean Water Act, or Act 64 of 2015, with the popular slogan, "All in for clean water," because it really does require action across all of the different land use sectors, from wastewater treatment facilities to floodplain restoration, forest management, agricultural management, managing runoff from our roads and other hard paved surfaces. And so those reasonable assurances that were put into place to target these sources of pollution involved establishing additional water quality regulations, establishing a state clean water fund that could be used to provide financial assistance to support these activities, and to put into place tracking systems that provide additional accountability on what progress is being made and how those projects that are being implemented on the ground translate into estimated pollutant reductions. So Act 64 really set the stage for a lot of the work we're talking about today. And then to follow up on Act 64 was the Clean Water Service Delivery Act, or Act 76 of 2019 for short. And Act 76 followed up on Act 64 by establishing long-term revenue sources for the State Clean Water Fund, and established some updated priorities on how those dollars get budgeted by the Vermont Clean Water Board. In addition, Act 76 put into place 4 new grant programs, including the water quality restoration formula grants that we're focused on today, which will be held and awarded to these watershed-based regional organizations that have also been established through Act 76, called Clean Water Service Providers. In addition to the formula grants, Act 76 also established a statewide water quality enhancement grant program, a municipal stormwater regulation grant program, and a developed lands grant program that targets funding or financial assistance to 3-acre sites that are privately owned or operated. So really, formula grants are just one out of the 4 new funding programs that were established through Act 76. In addition to establishing the long-term funding source, these new grant programs, Act 76 was really targeting the non-regulatory phosphorus reductions that are necessary for us to restore Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog. So we anticipate that by implementing regulatory programs, we can get part of the way to meeting our phosphorus reduction goals, but there's still additional voluntary or non-regulatory actions that will be needed to achieve these reductions. And so really the formula grants and the work that the clean water service providers will be doing target those non-regulatory phosphorus reduction requirements for the Lake Champlain Basin and Lake Memphremagog Basin. In addition, we historically have never funded the operation and maintenance of clean water projects. So once these projects get implemented on the ground, they have a design life, a lifespan where they're going to perform and continue to reduce phosphorus over time. That's typically been a responsibility that we pass along to local partners, municipalities, or regional organizations. So Act 76 gave us the ability to begin providing some financial assistance to support those activities and additional tracking and accountability related to long-term operation and maintenance. And then finally, Act 76 sets up a framework where we will be establishing interim 5-year targets throughout our 20-year implementation timeframe for the Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog phosphorus TMDLs, which gives us a little bit more of enhanced accountability on this incremental interim cycle. And Ben will get into a little bit more of that when we get to his piece of the presentation. So today's presentation and today's public meeting is really focused on the water quality restoration formula grants, which, as I mentioned before, is one of 4 grant programs that was established by Act 76. The formula grants will be awarded to clean water service providers that were established through Act 76 and through rulemaking. So we have many clean water service providers that have been established for each of the watersheds in Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog Basin. A mix of regional planning commissions, Vermont Housing Conservation Board, and the Poultney Meadowy Regional Planning Commission are serving in that role. and they will be advised in their decision-making on how they award funding by a Basin Water Quality Council with representation from many different organizations. The geographic focus of formula grants initially is for Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog, and it's structured at the tactical basin planning level watershed. So for example, within the Lake Champlain Basin, there's a clean water service provider for the Winooski Basin, Otter Creek Basin, South Lake, and so on. That Act 76 does require us to establish a schedule for expanding this formula grant framework to other watersheds targeting other pollutants of concern by 2023. So by 2023, we will have a schedule for how this framework may be adapted to address other pollutants. The project types that will be eligible for funding under formula grants are really targeting, again, those non-regulatory voluntary projects that are needed to reduce phosphorus and meeting the TMDL. And the funding levels each year will be determined as part of the annual Clean Water Board budget process, with 15% of the total funding going to the administration of the formula grants by the clean water service providers, and then 85% of those funds will be going toward project work. So it could be project identification, development, design, or implementation. And then operation and maintenance funding is going to be handled by a separate budgetary process. So fund dispersal, those funds in the formula grant will be dispersed based on a formula. And that formula is based on those non-regulatory phosphorus reduction targets, which Ben is going to be presenting on the methods for how those were established. And then they'll also be dispersed based on a cost per unit phosphorus reduced, bringing those two things together. And I'll be presenting on how we went about establishing those cost rates. So the public comment period that's going from March 28th to May 2nd that we're in right now, and today's public meeting are really focused on the fund dispersal methods for formula grants. And these formula grants will go into effect July 1st of 2022, or state fiscal year 2023. And just a little bit of background on clean water service providers. These are the organizations that will be receiving and administering formula grants and reporting on progress as projects are implemented. The clean water service providers will help to identify, develop funding for clean water projects in partnership with the clean water service providers. Those basin water quality councils will have representation from the conservation districts, regional planning commissions, watershed-based organizations, municipalities, and conservation organizations. Basin water quality councils are intended to provide local water quality knowledge to establish policy and make decisions on how the QUISP funding is allocated and prioritizing projects. And that's all going to be orchestrated as part of the tactical basin planning process and in partnership with the DEC basin planner. A&R DEC's role in this equation is we establish those clean water service providers through rulemaking. We are developing formula grant guidelines and policies on how these funds and grant programs will operate. We support the annual budget process that determines how much funding goes to formula grants each year, and we oversee progress and satisfactory determination. In addition to the kind of annual cycle of budget making and formula grant award, Ben's team will be working to establish those interim 5-year non-regulatory targets for clean water service providers. And we will be working on maintaining a methodology to estimate the standard cost per unit of phosphorus reduced, which we'll be presenting on a little bit more later today. DEC will participate in Basin Water Quality Council meetings, and we will also provide technical assistance and tools. So I'll pause there before we get into the methods that we'll be presenting on the focus of this public comment period to see if there are any questions on the background. Feel free to raise your hand using the raise hand function in Teams. All right, not seeing any, I will move on, and I'm going to hand it over to Ben.
Emily. So I'm going to dive into a little bit of the methodology for how we calculated the formula grant targets and funding levels. And really the starting point to this, as Emily mentioned, are the Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog phosphorus TMDLs. So both of these TMDLs require reductions across agriculture, developed wastewater treatment facility, stream, and forest lands to meet TMDL reduction targets. And these have been broken down by the tactical basin plan. So we have the loading reductions that are required per basin. Move on to the next slide. So as Emily mentioned, there's two elements to meeting our reduction targets. So Act 64 provides a lot of regulatory programs that are going to achieve a significant reduction in phosphorus through a number of different regulatory programs. And so what we're talking about today are essentially the phosphorus reductions that are not going to be met through those regulatory programs. And those non-regulatory phosphorus reduction targets are the targets for our clean water service providers. So together, between the regulatory and non-regulatory reductions, we can achieve our TMDL reduction targets. If you want to move on to our next. And so there's really three basic steps in setting these clean water service provider targets. So I'm going to start off talking around how we identified what we'll achieve through those regulatory programs in terms of phosphorus reductions. And we simply subtract that from our TMDL reduction targets to provide our overall clean water service provider reduction targets. Then I'm going to hand it back over to Emily, who's going to dive into how we've estimated the cost per kilogram for reducing phosphorus loading for our different. And then finally, we're going to dive into the scaling of the budget and the reduction targets based on the amount of funding available. So if you want to move on to the next slide, and I am trying to keep this at a pretty high level here today. So if people have questions or want to dive into some of the details, we can certainly do that when we get to the question and answer portion. But essentially through our target setting process, we've looked at the regulatory reductions across each of the major sectors that are included in the TMDL. And each of these different sectors has a different set of regulations. And so we've been able to estimate how much those regulations will achieve in terms of phosphorus reductions. So within the agricultural sector, the reduction breakdown between regulatory and non-regulatory was defined in a legislative report. And essentially 90% of the field reductions for agricultural reductions will be achieved through the Agency of Agriculture and NRCS regulatory and best management practice programs. And 10% of that reduction target for our agricultural lands will be provided to our clean water service providers for agricultural projects on non-RAP farms, so farms that are generally less than 4 cows, as well as natural resource restoration projects on larger farms. Within the stream sector, we've had to do some high-level estimates for how much we think our regulatory programs will achieve in terms of reducing our phosphorus loading from our stream systems. So we have our stream alteration permit. We have statewide regulations of river corridors through Act 250. And then we also have town adoption of river corridor regulations. And these regulatory programs together, we've roughly estimated as achieving about 2/3 of the phosphorus reductions required across our stream systems to meet our TMDL reduction targets. So this means that 33% of the phosphorus reduction target for streams will be assigned to the clean water service providers. And so these are high-level estimates at this point in time. We're looking to have much better estimates for what these regulatory programs may achieve through our Functioning Floodplains Initiative program. So we're going to, in future years, have more refined estimates. When it gets between 5 of our basins, so Otter Creek, North Lake Champlain, Lamoille, Winooski, and Memphremagog basins all have phosphorus reduction targets of 5% from the forest sector. And we estimate that 100% of that, so about a 5% reduction across our forest land, will be achieved through the acceptable management practices for forest lands. On the other hand, the South Lake Champlain Basin, as well as Missisquoi basins, have reduction targets of 40% of the forest loading for South Lake and 50% for Missisquoi. So that 5% reduction across our forest lands relates to about a 12% of the load reduction target for South Lake and 10% of the load reduction target for Missisquoi Bay, which leaves 88% of that loading for the South Lake and 90% for Missisquoi for the clean water service provider. So the final sector is our developed land sector, and we have 4 different regulatory programs within our stormwater program where we've estimated individual load reductions across those regulatory programs for each of the individual basins. So we have our municipal road general permit. We have our, what we call the 3-acre permit, essentially requiring reductions from our parcels that have over 3 acres of impervious surface that don't have permits in place, as well as our MS4 and TS4 permits that require reductions from our larger municipalities and our state transportation systems. So together, all of those regulatory programs on average achieve about 50% of the phosphorus reduction target from our developed lands, and the remaining phosphorus reductions are provided to our clean water service providers. But those do vary quite a bit between basins, where some basins have a much higher percentage of their phosphorus reduction being achieved through those stormwater programs, while others, such as Missisquoi Bay, have much smaller percentages of the phosphorus being reduced through those regulatory programs. If we want to move on to the next one, and I'll hand it back over to Emily.
Back to me. Okay. And I'm going to follow. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we went about estimating a standard cost per unit of phosphorus reduced, which we're referring to as a cost rate. So Act 76 requires that as part of the formula grant structure, we establish a standard cost per unit of phosphorus reduced. And then taking it one step further, our rulemaking related to formula grants and clean water service providers had us break that out by land use sector, acknowledging that a unit of phosphorus reduced, say, by restoring natural resources and stream restoration may not be the same as cost as a unit of phosphorus reduced by implementing a stormwater treatment practice. So we wanted to account for the varying degrees of cost, acknowledging that there's reductions that are needed across all these different land use sectors. So these cost rates include costs of project identification, development, design, implementation, and operation and maintenance that will be covered under the formula grant system. Although I'll just flag that operation and maintenance costs are going to be estimated through a separate budget exercise and are beyond the scope of what we're presenting on here today. So along with the target work that Ben just presented on, these cost rates will be correlated together with those targets to inform the allocation of formula grant funding. And I'm just going to walk you through, there's a lot more detail provided in the document that is posted for public comment, but at a high level, what the cost rate methodology steps are to estimate for the cost per unit of phosphorus reduced, factoring in the design and engineering costs, if applicable, as well as implementation or construction costs. So the first step we took is we identified project categories that are representative of non-regulatory work that will be occurring under the formula grants. So this includes floodplain restoration, river corridor easements, lakeshore restoration, riparian buffer restoration, water treatment, non-regulatory road-related erosion controls, for example. And in a couple slides, we'll get to a table where it'll show all of those project categories. So we identified those project categories, and then we estimated for each of those project categories the cost per project output unit. So an output unit is something along the lines of acres of impervious surface treated by a stormwater treatment practice, or acres of riparian buffer restored along a stream bank to help to improve stream stability and to filter runoff from the adjacent land use. So just a couple examples to give you some context. And then we incorporated into that cost per project output unit, of course, the cost of implementing or constructing, but then we also incorporated design and engineering estimates where applicable. And again, operation and maintenance is going to be handled through a separate budget exercise. Then we looked at, for each project output unit, what is a general average or median estimated total phosphorus load reduction that you could expect by achieving that. So for each acre of riparian buffer restored, based on data we've seen of real projects that have been implemented, what is the typical phosphorus reduction you would expect from that? And then we related the cost per project output unit to the cost per, or the estimated phosphorus reduction per project output unit. And that's how we arrived at a final cost per unit phosphorus reduced for each of these project categories. And all of the costs related to design, engineering, construction are front-loaded and not spread out over time, acknowledging that there's a need for that capital investment to occur upfront. However, the total phosphorus load reductions are expressed as an annual average to be consistent with the Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog phosphorus TMDLs, how those targets are expressed in the units that those are expressed in. So to give an example project, take a riparian buffer restoration project, for example. Here's one where we have some members of our team doing a verification site visit. A riparian buffer supports in-stream stability, which helps with the TMDL streams load allocation targets. The riparian buffer would also result in a land use conversion from a previous land use, like pervious developed, into forested over time. And that would support the developed waste load allocation. And then if the riparian buffer is treating runoff from an upland area, then let's say that upland area was developed pervious, then it would contribute to the developed waste load allocation. So these projects can vary in terms of how they contribute to different land use sectors based on the land uses that are being treated by these practices. So in this example of riparian buffer restoration, we reviewed our data set of clean water projects that have been implemented from state fiscal year 2016 through 2020, sample size of 102 projects. In the case of riparian buffers, there's not design or engineering applicable. However, oftentimes these projects include project scoping and development baked into this cost. We identified the median cost per acre of riparian buffer restored was $7,200. Then we looked at a typical acre restored and what phosphorus reductions you could get from restoring an acre of riparian buffer, and accounting for those three different functions: treating the runoff from the upland area, the land use conversion, and through improved stream stability. A typical acre of riparian buffer restored would result in 1.4 kilogram reduction of phosphorus. So then you relate the cost, the median cost per acre, to the estimated phosphorus reduction per acre to arrive at $5,000 per kilogram per year of total phosphorus load reduction. And that methodology is repeated in the documents that were posted for public comment for each of the project categories that are representative of this non-regulatory work. So you can see the details in that document for each of those project categories. Then we identified the project categories that may contribute phosphorus reductions to targets by land use sector based on the land uses that are treated by these different project types. So for example, in the stream sector, we anticipate that floodplain or stream restoration projects, river corridor easements, and riparian buffer restoration would contribute to meeting targets in the stream sector. For the developed lands, we anticipate that stormwater best management practices, non-regulatory stormwater best management practices, road best management practices, riparian buffer restoration, and lake shoreline and lake shoreline runoff treatment practices would contribute to the non-regulatory developed lands sector, and so on and so forth. And in order to arrive at a sector, high-level sector average cost rate, we bundled these by sector, incorporating the design and implementation costs in these cost rates here, and averaged them, the costs by sector. And we went with this, or we proposed this simple high-level average due to the fact that right now this is high-level estimate, but we may be able to revisit the weighting in the future if we find that that's appropriate. So for example, if we're finding that in the stream sector, a higher proportion of the target is being achieved or has the potential to be achieved by doing riparian buffer restoration projects, then perhaps we could weight that a little bit heavier in the averaging for that sector. And then the next step, we took these average cost rates per sector and correlated them with the target work that Ben just presented on, and we'll get into a little bit more to inform the allocation of formula grant funds by watershed. And before we get into the detail allocation and scaling, I wanted to explain how we incorporated project identification and development costs into this methodology. So project identification is the exercise of doing some kind of a geographic area, whether it's a municipality or a subwatershed, evaluation of the landscape to identify opportunities to implement projects and prioritize those opportunities. So this may look like a stormwater master plan, a river corridor plan, a lake watershed action plan, for example. And the goal of these project identification is to identify a suite of project opportunities for further development and to prioritize them. So acknowledging that one project identification effort may result in the identification and prioritization of dozens of projects, we were a little bit challenged in how we could tie that directly to the phosphorus reduction. So rather than incorporating this in the project type cost rates that we just looked over before, we're proposing accounting for project identification and development costs as a percentage of the total formula grant funding. And in addition, not all of, so it's further challenging to try to tie individual project outputs and phosphorus reduction costs to project ID and development, because not all projects that are identified will ultimately be successful or be considered a high priority or cost effective. And many of these non-regulatory projects may encounter barriers as they proceed toward implementation through the development process. So for example, there may not be capacity to implement, or a landowner may change their mind in terms of being willing to have the project sited on their property. So acknowledging this complexity, we are proposing a percentage rate approach where we look at the total available formula grant dollars for project implementation. So setting aside the 15% that will be available for administration of the formula grants, of that 85% that's available to do project work, 7% of the funds would be going to project identification and development. And that is based on, we looked at historic data from state fiscal year 2016 to 2021, and on average, 3% of the total formula grant, or of the total state clean water funding was awarded to project identification. So we're assuming a similar percentage in the formula grant system. And then additionally, in the last couple of years, we began providing funding for project development activities. So this is really supporting partners' capacity to be able to shepherd these projects forward from identification through to design and implementation stages, doing the landowner outreach, navigating the different funding processes, and helping to secure permits and facilitating project review and screening. So that whole scope of project development, based on a review of our past 2 years of funding, about 4% of the clean water funding that we've administered from our program since we started funding this in the last couple of years, 4% of that has gone to project development. So when you add those two together, the 3 and the 4%, it gives you that 7% total, which is what we have factored into the fund allocation methodology. So now I'm going to hand it back to Ben to talk about the next steps to tie these sector cost rates together with the targets to inform the fund allocation.
Emily,
think
there's
that-
a question for you in the chat from Jill about averaging. Would you like to take it now or a little later?
Sure, we can take it now.
Okay. She asked, back to averages, is there any variation on the statewide averages based on local geographic considerations, such as landscape, soil type, built infrastructure, or social conditions?
Jill, is that with regard to the project ID and development, or was that with regard to the average cost rates per project category? Oh, is Jill still here? Oh, average cost rate per project category. Yeah, so that geographic variation is definitely something that we have identified as an opportunity to kind of monitor and revisit in the future. We don't really have sufficient data to be establishing regionalized, regionally varied cost rates at this point, but it is something we've identified that if we are finding that there's significant regional variation in project costs, that we may want to reconsider that. So it is a really good flag. And that's, I guess, a good point with all of this is our first year doing this, and we still, we're trying to keep this exercise at a high level, and high level estimates with some flexibility for this to be modified each year as we move forward. So we have some plans of specific items to monitor, and that's described in the methodology document that's been posted for public comment. And we may be revisiting and revising this methodology in future years if we find that there's better data to support adjustments in the methodology. And Ben, is there anything you want to add to that from your perspective?
No, I think that covers it, just that we're early in this process. And I think that's as we get further along and we have more of a justification for having some adjustments in different regions, we can certainly consider that. So.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Jill. That was a great question.
Yeah, so I can dive now into the next step in the process for setting these target reductions and funding levels for clean water service providers. And that's really taking those cost rates for each of the sectors and multiplying it by the clean water service provider targets for the individual sector on an annual basis, and doing that for all of the 7 basins that are part of this process. So we went through that process, and when we multiply all of the load reduction targets by those cost rates, we get a funding level that's far above what we have in terms of available funding for our clean water funds for this next state fiscal year. So that's required us to take an additional step of scaling those targets to the available funds. And so in constructing the clean water budget and considering the need to ramp up capacity this first year, the Clean Water Board approved $7 million investment for formula grants for state fiscal year 2023, which was a major increase in our non-regulatory project support. But to allocate this funding across the different basins, we also proposed setting a minimum funding level of around $650,000 per basin that is sufficient to sustain the implementation by partners and clean water service providers. So with that minimum in place, we then scaled the clean water service provider targets across all sectors based on the amount of available funding to set the phosphorus reduction targets and funding levels for state fiscal year 2023. So a couple of things that are important to consider in this. One is just that there's a lot of areas that have added to the need to scale back those targets. So some of these include the fact that we haven't yet been able to account for other non-regulatory reductions. So we have some other sources of funding that are providing support to implement non-regulatory projects, but we haven't accounted for that in this target setting exercise. We also have a lot of ongoing uncertainty in the regulatory stream and developed land sectors. where we suspect that the reduction targets will be reduced in future years for our clean water service providers as we further resolve some of the ongoing questions in those areas. And finally, we feel like as clean water service providers are working out in the landscape with an incentive to find highly effective phosphorus reduction projects, that those cost rates for those individual sectors may go down. And so that's something we're going to be keeping an eye on in future years. So a couple of those factors required us to substantially scale back the phosphorus reduction targets for each of the clean water service providers and the associated funding levels. I'm going to go on to the next. So as we did that phosphorus scaling, we did that for each of those different sectors. But because there's so much uncertainty across each of the different sectors, we've provided targets in terms of overall reduction targets for each of the basins. So we're not holding clean water service providers to targets specific to those individual sectors. And so when we look at the results of this exercise, you see that the Missisquoi Basin has the largest reduction target of around 145 kilograms per year, with a total funding level of just under $2 million. Then we have the South Lake Basin, Otter Creek, and the Winooski Basins that have targets that range from just under 70 to 80 kilograms per year, with funding levels of around $1 million. And then we have our three basins, the North Lake Champlain Direct, Lamoille, and Lake Memphremagog basins, where we had that minimum funding level, which each have reduction targets of around 40 to 45 kilograms per year, with the funding level just below $650,000. So I think that's the I don't know if people have some questions around those final targets or.
And all of the tables that articulate the targets in the fund allocation are in the Appendix A of the draft methods that were posted for public comments. You can see all those detailed numbers there. All right, I don't see any hands or hear any questions yet. Oh, one just came through. So is that total per basin based on weighted average of project types?
Yeah, so I think the cost rates are based on a straight up average of the project types for each category, for each sector. But then the individual clean water service provider targets are based on the targets based on the specific sectors. So within some basins, there's more of that phosphorus is coming from the agricultural sector. And there, because of the lower cost rate, those clean water service providers will have less funding for the amount of phosphorus because more of their target comes from that agricultural sector. So I'm not sure if that quite answers your question there, Jill, but essentially the breakdown across the different sectors for each basin has an impact on how much funding each clean water service provider will get based on those different cost rates for the different sectors.
So it just maybe one other way of framing that too is that if you have a basin where there's more phosphorus reduction potential in a more expensive land use sector, like developed lands, for example, then each unit of phosphorus reduced in that basin is expected to be somewhat more expensive than other basins. So they may end up getting slightly more funding allocated for their target, where compared to a basin that maybe has more stream restoration potential or ag reduction potential, then the achievement of those phosphorus reduction targets may be relatively less expensive. So it's kind of weighted in from that respect. But Ben mentioned that we're not establishing targets by sector. We're just establishing a total reduction target for the time being. And Jill, I see you with your hand up if you want to jump in and add to that or clarify?
I'm bad at typing. I'm bad at typing well.
No worries.
So I just want to make sure I understand. So you took the TMDL targets and reduced them across basins proportionately to get to your budget number, right? So you didn't make any adjustments between project types from the TMDL, right? Does that make sense? It's hard to say this stuff verbally.
Jill, are you saying there was no reallocation of the TMDL targets across sectors? Is that?
Yes, there was just a similar proportionate reduction based on budget availability. So
Yeah,
say
so I
the
think
true cost was, I don't know, let's say the true cost was 14 million per year. You cut everything in half.
Yep,
Just
so-
as an example.
Yeah, essentially we cut everything in half with the exception of the basins where we had that minimum target set. So
Right.
those ones, we pulled those out first and kind of set that minimum funding level for those 3 basins. And then we scaled all of
Yeah, that makes sense.
the basins equally. And then actually very specifically to provide the funding for those 3 basins, we took that funding from the Missisquoi basin to bring those up to that $650,000 level. So those are the very specific adjustments that we actually made through that process. And again, if you go to I think those are pretty clearly outlined in the target setting. It's hard to kind of go through the details.
It is. Without showing people all your math online. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill. Thanks, Ben. All right, so I'm going to move us along here with an overview of public notice and comment period. Just to orient you where we are at in our timeline here, we've been working on this for a little while now, leading up to this milestone. So August of 2021, clean water service providers were established through rulemaking. December of 2021, the formula grant state fiscal year 2023 funding levels were set by the Clean Water Board as part of the state fiscal year 23 clean water budget process. And then beginning in September, spanning through February, we've been working on developing these draft targets and fund allocation methodology, getting some feedback internally, and then beginning February through March of 2022, we engaged with a subgroup of our Act 76 advisory stakeholder group, and we briefed them by presenting these draft methods and have circulated these documents for their feedback as well. So there's already been some level of stakeholder engagement and input incorporated in the methods that we now have posted for public comment. So now we are in the middle of this public comment period spanning from March 28th to May 2nd. Where we've posted these draft methods for public comment. Public comment is due May 2nd, and then over the course of the month of May, we will work on responding to public comment and finalizing the targets and fund allocation methodology. And then in July, we have planned to have our formula finalized and for formula grants to be executed. And these targets will be baked into those formula grant agreements. That's where we're at in the timeline. And this is kind of a lot, so bear with me. But comments must be submitted through the state's environmental notice bulletin. And that's linked here as well as on our website. And we are required to use the environmental notice bulletin due to a statutory requirement that we follow type 3 procedures for public comment. So this may be new to some of our typical stakeholders to be using this interface. So there are a bunch of instructions on our website on how to navigate this, and you can access this posting on the Environmental Notice Bulletin by going to the Environmental Notice Bulletin website, searching for the Water Investment Division, Clean Water Initiative, and then you'll see the sub-bullet points there and the 2 documents posted, 2 activities posted. We have what we're talking about today, the water quality restoration formula grant targets and fund allocation methodology. And you'll also see the quantification of pollution reduction methods that are also posted for public comment between now and May 2nd. And there's a public meeting on that content this Friday. So instructions on how to use this are available on the website, and there's a number of materials that are directly linked here. If you're interested in accessing it through the PowerPoint slides, or you can go to the website that the URL is spelled out here. Maybe, oh, it looks like, thank you, Gianna, for dropping all of these links into the chat. That's super helpful. And I wanted to highlight that if you have any technical questions fundamentally on how to use the environmental notice bulletin, you can email the ENB administrator email here. Please use the subject line Act 76 of 2019 public comment, just so they can stay consolidated and organized. And then if you have any general questions about the public comment process, you're welcome to email the Clean Water Initiative Program email account with that same subject line. But I want to just stress that we're really requiring that all comments submitted go through the environmental notice bulletin so that we don't run into an issue of comments coming into multiple places. So if you are submitting comment, please use the environmental notice bulletin. And you do not need an environmental notice bulletin account to comment, but if you want to attach your comments as an attachment, like a Word document or a PDF, then you do need to create an account, and there are instructions on how to do that. And on our website, we have a couple of templates that are recommended to use to organize your comments under the same headers that exist in the sections of these documents, so that we can stay organized in how we process and compile comments. So a little bit of a new process for us as well. Appreciate your patience. And if you have any issues or questions, feel free to get in touch. I mentioned it a little bit ago, but just a final reminder that we have another public meeting following up this one on the phosphorus tracking and accounting standard operating procedures that will be led by Helen Carr this Friday from noon to 1:30, same time, same place, physical meeting location. And then there's also a Teams link for folks who would like to connect via Teams. And those details are posted on the calendar. And I suspect that Gianna's getting ready to drop it right into the chat right now, which she did. Thanks, Gianna. So we appreciate your participation today and hope to see folks on Friday if you're able to make it. So with that, I think that concludes our presentation. Happy to answer any clarifying questions on the content that has been presented today. And then we can open it up for public comment. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand and we can call on you to unmute and vocalize your question, or you can type it into the chat. Okay. I'm not seeing any questions, so if there aren't any questions, we can open it up for public comment. Is there anybody on the line who would like to comment? Jill, go ahead.
Thank you. It takes a minute for AT&T to unmute me. My initial reaction to the project development percentage that you calculated was that it seemed low to me. I guess I want to say I'm not sure that the history of your grant making reflects the true costs, as much of that project development has been done by voluntary organizations who have not been paid. So I think I'd ask you to consider identifying maybe a floor for some of those costs. 4% for a small project is a teeny amount of money, and it sometimes takes as much effort to get a small project developed as it does a larger project developed. So that's my comment on that. That was the only thing I kind of had a reaction to that you presented. Thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting.
Thank you, Jill. Appreciate your comment. And maybe I should also add that we're going to record comments that come in today. We're going to compile them with any comments that get submitted in writing. We'll be drafting drafting up a responsiveness summary to respond to all of the comments. So stay tuned for that. Any other comments or questions? All right. Well, not hearing any requests for comment. And if there aren't any other questions, I suppose we can wrap up a little bit early. Really appreciate you taking the time to attend this meeting. Like I mentioned before, we'll be posting the recording on YouTube for anybody who wasn't able to make it today. We'll be sending out some reminders to our stakeholder notification listserv as we approach the deadline for comment. So stay tuned, and we welcome your feedback if you'd like to participate by submitting your comments. And another final reminder of this Friday's public meeting on the phosphorus tracking and accounting standard operating procedures. Feel free to get in touch if you have any questions on the process. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Everett?
Have a good day. Take care.
See you Friday.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.